Man, the beggar, and the magnate. The fine morning rain had left the marble sidewalks glistening when Adrian Castellanos pushed through the heavy revolving door of the Meridian Tower building. His Italian leather shoes, purchased from an exclusive Milan boutique, echoed with authority across the vast entrance lobby. The sound reverberated against the glass and steel walls, announcing the arrival of someone who knew exactly what his place in the world was. Adrian was 28 years old and held a mid-level management position at Castellanos & Sons, a real estate investment firm his family had built over 3 generations. He wasn't the primary heir. That title belonged to his older brother, Ricardo. But Adrian had earned his position through merit, or at least that's what he liked to believe. His colleagues respected him. His salary was enviable. His future seemed traced in straight golden lines. On that Thursday morning, Adrian had arrived 15 minutes early for a crucial meeting. The company was negotiating the acquisition of a historic downtown property, land that could be transformed into a luxury residential complex. The project was worth tens of millions, and Adrian had spent weeks preparing the presentation. He adjusted his silk tie as he walked toward the elevators, his leather briefcase swinging slightly at his side. The lobby was nearly empty at that hour, just a few security guards at their posts and a cleaning crew finishing the night shift. That's when Adrian saw him. Sitting on one of the marble benches near the entrance, hunched as if trying to occupy the smallest space possible, was an elderly man. His clothing was a collection of patches and wear, a dark brown coat that had once been elegant decades ago, pants with permanent stains on the knees, shoes so worn that the leather had separated from the sole in places. A grizzled grey beard covered much of his face, and his eyes, though alert, carried the exhaustion of someone who had seen too much and slept far too little. The old man held a small paper bag against his chest, as if it contained something precious. Adrian frowned. How had that man gotten past security? The Meridian Tower building had strict protocols. It was one of the most prestigious addresses in the city, housing international law firms, financial consultancies, and companies like his family's. Beggars shouldn't be able to get in. He looked around, searching for a security guard who could resolve the situation discreetly. But before he could signal, a sharp female voice cut through the lobby's silence. "Excuse me, you can't stay there." Adrian turned and saw Monica Salazar, the building's principal receptionist, marching toward the old man with an expression of barely disguised indignation. Monica was about 35. Always impeccably dressed in her corporate uniform, her hair pulled back in a bun, so tight it seemed to pull her forehead back. She took her job very seriously, perhaps too seriously. "I'm sorry," said the old man in a surprisingly calm and polite voice. "I have a scheduled meeting at 9 o'clock. Monica let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "A meeting? Here?" Her eyes traveled up and down the man, making no effort to conceal her disdain. "Sir, this is a commercial building. We don't offer social assistance services." Adrian found himself stopping to observe the scene. Part of him knew he should simply continue to the elevator. He had an important meeting, after all. But something about the situation kept him there, like an involuntary spectator to a small morning drama. "I understand," said the old man with remarkable patience. He opened the paper bag and took out a yellowed envelope. "I have this confirmation letter. The meeting is with Castellanos & Sons." Monica didn't even look at the envelope. "Confirmation letter? Sir, please. I've worked in this building for 8 years. I know all the important clients, and you're definitely not one of them." She made an impatient gesture with her hand. "Now be reasonable and leave, before I have to call security." It was at that moment Adrian approached. Not out of compassion. He would tell himself this later, in moments of brutal honesty, but out of curiosity and perhaps a desire to reaffirm his own position in that corporate ecosystem. "Some problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying exactly the right amount of casual authority. Monica turned, and her face lit up with recognition. "Ah, Mr. Castellanos, good morning. Sorry for the disturbance. This gentleman insists he has a meeting at your company, but clearly there's a misunderstanding. Adrian looked at the old man, who stared back with those tired eyes. For a brief instant, Adrian felt something, a flash of recognition perhaps, or just discomfort, but the feeling passed quickly. May I see the letter? Adrian extended his hand, more out of formality than genuine interest. The old man handed him the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. Not from fear, Adrian noted, but probably from age or perhaps cold. The envelope was folded and refolded so many times that the creases had become permanent. Adrian opened it and took a quick look. It was a formal letter from Castellanos and Sons, dated 3 weeks earlier, confirming a meeting for 9 o'clock that morning. The name in the header was Señor Tomás Herrera. Adrian vaguely recognized the name. He had seen it in some document during preparations for the historic property meeting. But that didn't make sense. The current owners of the property were a distinguished family, well connected. Not this. This letter appears legitimate, Adrian admitted, though his tone suggested there were still doubts. But I'm afraid there may be some confusion, Mr. Herrera. Our meeting this morning is with the owners of the Quinta Esperanza property, and I'm certain that I am the owner, said Tomás Herrera simply. There was a moment of silence. Then Monica burst out laughing, loud, shrill, without any shame. You're the owner, she repeated, as if she'd just heard the most absurd joke in the world. Of Quinta Esperanza. Sir, that property is worth a fortune. Please, let's be serious. Adrian felt a wave of irritation, not with Monica, but with that old man who was clearly trying to deceive them or was confused. Quinta Esperanza was one of the last undeveloped historic lots in the heart of the city, surrounded by skyscrapers and luxury. Records indicated the property had belonged to the Herrera family for generations, but Adrian had assumed it was a wealthy family, not this. Mr. Herrera, said Adrian, trying to maintain a polite but firm tone, I understand you may have some historical connection to the property, but our records indicate that the current owners are— I am the sole owner, Tomás interrupted gently. My family has owned that land since 1852. It's registered in my name at the property registry office. I can show the documents if necessary. Monica rolled her eyes so dramatically that Adrian had to suppress a nervous laugh. She clearly thought this was all a waste of time. Sir, said Monica, her patience clearly exhausted, you need to leave now. This type of behavior isn't acceptable. If you really had a meeting, you would have arrived in a proper car with proper clothes. Look at yourself. And then she laughed again, a cruel laugh that echoed through the marble lobby. Adrian found himself laughing along. Not a loud guffaw like Monica's, but an amused smile, a slight headshake that said, yes, really, this is ridiculous. He looked at Tomás Herrera, at his worn clothes, his unkempt beard, his broken shoes, and simply couldn't conceive that this man could own one of the most valuable properties in the city. It was easy to laugh, it was easy to judge, and in the moment it seemed justified. Look, said Adrian, his voice now carrying a tone of condescension he didn't notice. Mr. Herrera, obviously there's some misunderstanding here. Our meeting is very important and starts soon. I suggest you go home, review your documents, and if there really is some legitimate issue, contact our office through appropriate channels. Tomás Herrera looked at him for a long moment. His eyes, those tired eyes, seemed to penetrate beyond the surface, seeing something Adrian couldn't or wouldn't see. I understand, the old man finally said. So you don't believe I am who I say I am? It's not about believing or not, Adrian responded, checking his Rolex watch ostentatiously. It's about protocols and procedures. If you really are the owner, I'm sure everything will become clear soon. But now, I really need to go. Monica was already signaling for one of the security guards to approach. Come on, Grandpa, she said with a tone of false patience, as if speaking to a stubborn child. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Adrian turned and began walking toward the elevators. He had only gone a few steps when he heard Tomas Herrera's voice behind him. Not loud, not angry, but carrying a sadness that, for some reason, made Adrian slow down. "My wife used to say you can know a person's true character by how they treat those who can do nothing for them." Adrian stopped. The words hung in the air like smoke, but then he pressed the elevator button and shook his head. How absurd. An old beggar trying to give moral lessons. He probably repeated phrases like that to get handouts. The elevator doors opened and Adrian entered, leaving Tomas Herrera behind. The 22nd floor of Castellanos & Sons was a world apart, a sanctuary of Persian carpets, noble wood panels, and carefully curated contemporary art. Adrian crossed the corridor to the large conference room, where his brother Ricardo and his father, Don Eduardo Castellanos, were already gathered with the legal team. "Late," Ricardo joked when Adrian entered. "Not at all, just dealing with a small situation in the lobby." Don Eduardo, a man in his 60s with silver temples and an air of unquestionable authority, looked up from the documents he was studying. "What kind of situation?" "Nothing important," said Adrian, settling into his chair. "A beggar claiming to be the owner of Quinta Esperanza. The receptionist is handling it." There was laughter around the table. Even Don Eduardo smiled. "These types always show up when there's money involved," Ricardo commented. "Remember that case with the San Miguel property? We had 3 different people claiming to be legitimate heirs." The conversation moved to other matters: negotiation strategies, offer values, construction timelines. Adrian presented his slides confidently, answered questions precisely, and felt that familiar wave of satisfaction that came from doing his job well. The meeting was scheduled to start at 9 o'clock sharp. At 9:05, they were still waiting. "Where are the sellers?" asked Ricardo, checking his phone. Don Eduardo's executive assistant, an efficient woman named Patricia, entered the room. "Pardon the interruption, Don Eduardo. There's a strange situation. The representative of the Quinta Esperanza owners is here, but what?" Don Eduardo frowned. Patricia hesitated. "Well, he doesn't look exactly what we expected. Security stopped him in the lobby, and there's some confusion." Adrian felt a chill run down his spine. "What does he look like?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "An older gentleman. Very simple clothes. He has documents, but the receptionist thought it was some kind of scam, and..." Adrian stood up so quickly, his chair rolled backward. "My God," he murmured. "No." Don Eduardo also stood, his expression changing from confusion to concern. "Adrian, do you know something about this?" "The beggar in the lobby," said Adrian, feeling the blood drain from his face. "Father, I think I've made a terrible mistake." They ran to the elevator. Adrian, Don Eduardo, Ricardo, and 2 of the lawyers. The descent from 22 floors seemed to last an eternity. Adrian felt his heart hammering against his ribs, his mind spinning in panic. Please, let him still be there. Please, don't let it be too late. The elevator doors opened in the lobby, and Adrian ran out. What he saw made his stomach sink. Tomas Herrera was being escorted toward the exit by 2 security guards. Monica watched with satisfaction, arms crossed. The old man wasn't resisting. He simply walked with silent dignity, his paper bag still clutched against his chest. "Stop!" Don Eduardo's voice echoed through the lobby like thunder. Everyone froze. Don Eduardo Castellanos was known in the city. His reputation preceded him. A shrewd businessman, yes, but also someone of his word, of unshakable integrity. When he spoke, people listened. He walked directly to Tomas Herrera, and to everyone's absolute shock in the lobby, Don Eduardo extended his hand. "Mr. Herrera," he said, his voice laden with respect and a touch of embarrassment. "Please forgive me immensely. There's been a terrible misunderstanding." Tomas looked at the extended hand for a long moment before accepting it. "Don Eduardo," he said simply. They knew each other. Adrian felt as if the ground had opened beneath his feet. Don Eduardo turned to the security guards and Monica, his face a mask of controlled anger. "Who authorized this gentleman to be treated this way?" Monica went pale. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Don Eduardo turned back to Tomas. "Mr. Herrera, please allow me to personally escort you to our office, and again my sincerest apologies for this unworthy reception." As they walked toward the elevator, Don Eduardo and Tomas side by side, followed by Ricardo, the lawyers, and a completely mortified Adrian. Monica remained frozen in the lobby, her face going through several shades from white to red. In the elevator, a heavy silence hung. Adrian couldn't look at anyone. He kept his eyes fixed on the illuminated numbers above the door, watching them climb. 8, 9, 10. It was Tomas who broke the silence. "Don Eduardo," he said calmly, "you don't need to apologize for your employees. Each person is responsible for their own actions." Don Eduardo shook his head. "Even so, Mr. Herrera, you are a guest in our building, and you were treated abominably. That's not acceptable." When they reached the conference room, Patricia had already prepared fresh coffee and organized the documents. Tomas Herrera sat at the head of the table, the place of honor, and finally opened his paper bag. What he took out made everyone in the room fall silent. Documents, dozens of them, all carefully organized in transparent plastic folders, some yellowed with age, deeds dating from the 19th century, property certificates, tax records paid year after year, decade after decade, a meticulously documented family lineage that traced the ownership of Quinta Esperanza through 6 generations of the Herrera family. Tomas placed each document on the table with reverent care, as if they were sacred relics, and in a sense, they were. "My great-great-grandfather, Don Alfonso Herrera, bought this land in 1852. Tomas began, his voice transformed, no longer the voice of an old man being expelled from a lobby, but the voice of a historian, a keeper of memories. He was a textile merchant, a simple man who saved every peso for 20 years to buy that piece of land. At that time, it wasn't anything special, just an open field on the outskirts of the city. He slid an old photograph across the table. It showed the property in question, surrounded by empty fields, a small stone house in one corner. My great-great-grandfather built that house with his own hands. He and my great-great-grandmother, Doña Carmen, raised 7 children there. When my great-great-grandfather died, the property passed to my great-grandfather, Don Miguel. He was a carpenter. He expanded the house, added a garden, planted trees that are still there today. Another photograph, the house now larger, surrounded by young trees. My grandfather, also named Alfonso, inherited the property during the Revolution. Difficult times. He hid persecuted families in that house, saved lives. The property was almost confiscated 3 times, but my grandfather had the right documents, knew the right people, and protected our family heritage. More documents, official letters, government seals. Adrian listened, fascinated and horrified. Each word from Tomas was a silent accusation, a mirror reflecting his own failure. My father, Tomas continued, received offers to sell the property. Many offers. After the city grew around Quinta Esperanza, after the skyscrapers began to rise, after the land became valuable, he received offers that would have made our family rich. Offers from banks, from corporations, from foreign investors. Tomas paused, his eyes sweeping the room. He refused them all, not out of stubbornness, but because that land was more than just land. It was history. It was memory. It was my great-great-grandfather's sweat, my great-grandfather's blood, my grandfather's courage. How do you put a price on things like that? Don Eduardo nodded slowly, deep understanding in his eyes. "When my father died," said Tomas, "the property passed to me. I'm the last of the Herrera family. I have no children. My wife, Luz, may God have her in his glory, passed away 5 years ago. I'm alone now." He looked at the photographs scattered across the table. For a long time, I held on to the property the same way my father did. But I'm old. I'm tired. And I realize that holding on to something isn't the same as honoring it. Quinta Esperanza should serve life, not be an empty monument to memories. Tomás picked up one last document from his bag, an agreement already drafted, detailing the terms under which he would sell the property. "I've decided to sell," he said, "but not to just anyone. I want to sell to someone who understands that this land has a soul, someone who will build something that respects its history, that contributes to the community, that isn't just another luxury building for the wealthy." He slid the document toward Don Eduardo. "Your name was suggested by a mutual friend, Don Eduardo. He told me you're a man of principles, that you build with conscience. That's why I came here this morning, hoping to find a business family that could be stewards of the next generation of Quinta Esperanza." Don Eduardo picked up the document with hands that Adrian noticed were slightly trembling. His father, always so controlled, always so steady, was visibly moved. "Mr. Herrera," said Don Eduardo, his voice hoarse, "it's an honor that you've considered our company, and I can promise you, on my word and my family's name, that we'll treat this land with the respect it deserves." Tomás nodded. "I believe you, Don Eduardo, but I must be honest. After what happened in the lobby this morning, I have my doubts." The silence that followed was crushing. Don Eduardo looked at Adrian, not with anger, but with something worse, disappointment. "Mr. Herrera," said Don Eduardo calmly, "my son Adrian was involved in this morning's incident. Adrian, would you like to address Mr. Herrera?" Adrian felt all eyes in the room on him. His face burned. His throat was dry. For a moment he considered making excuses, softening what had happened, trying to deflect responsibility. But then he looked at Tomás Herrera, really looked at him for the first time, and what he saw wasn't a beggar or a confused old man. He saw a man who had carried generations of history on his shoulders. A man who had been judged not by the content of his character, but by the condition of his clothes. A man he had helped humiliate. Adrian stood up, his legs unsteady. He walked around the table until he stood in front of Tomás. "Mr. Herrera," Adrian began, his voice breaking slightly, "there's no adequate excuse for how I treated you this morning. I judged you by your appearance. I laughed. I ignored you. And in doing so, I revealed something horrible about myself, that I value surface more than substance, status more than character." Tears welled up in Adrian's eyes. He didn't try to hide them. "My father raised me better than that. My mother taught me to treat all people with respect, but somewhere along the way, I forgot those lessons. I got caught up in a world where the clothes you wear and the car you drive seem to define who you are." He paused, trying to find the right words. "You said something this morning about knowing a person's true character by how they treat those who can do nothing for them. I failed that test completely, and the most painful part is that it wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of who I've become." Adrian looked directly into Tomás's eyes. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Mr. Herrera. I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want you to know that if you choose to do business with our company, I will personally ensure that Quinta Esperanza is treated as the treasure it is. And more importantly, I'll use this experience to become a better man, the kind of man my father hoped I would be." When Adrian finished, tears were running freely down his face. He didn't wipe them away. He let them fall. Tomás Herrera studied Adrian for a long moment. Then, slowly, the old man stood from his chair. He was shorter than Adrian, his spine curved with age, but somehow he seemed taller. Tomás extended his hand. Adrian took it, squeezing it with reverence. "Son," said Tomás softly, "we all fail. The real test isn't whether we make mistakes, but what we do afterward. You could have made excuses. You could have tried to minimize your actions, but instead you stood here and took full responsibility. That requires courage." He squeezed Adrian's hand tighter. "I forgive you. And more than that, I trust you've learned something valuable today." The negotiation for Quinta Esperanza took 3 months to finalize. During that time, Adrian came to know Tomas Herrera in ways he never imagined. He learned that Tomas wasn't poor. He had modest savings, a pension, a simple but dignified life. His worn clothes weren't the result of poverty, but of choice. Tomas believed in living modestly, in not wasting resources, in finding value in things that lasted. He learned that Tomas had been a history teacher for 40 years, teaching generations of children about their country, their city, their roots. That he had written 3 books on local history that were considered academic references, that he was respected by historians and scholars throughout the country. He learned that Tomas's wife, Luz, had been a nurse who worked in underserved communities, treating people who didn't have access to adequate medical care. That she had died doing the work she loved, caring for others. He learned that Tomas donated most of his pension to charity organizations, that he volunteered at shelters, that he had dedicated his life not to accumulating wealth, but to enriching the lives of others. And Adrian learned something about himself, that he had been living in a bubble, surrounded by people who thought like him, dressed like him, valued the same superficial things he had learned to value. On the afternoon when the final documents were signed, Tomas asked to speak with Adrian privately. They went to Adrian's small office, away from the bustle of the conference room. "Adrian," said Tomas, sitting in the chair facing the desk, "I have something for you." He took an envelope from his coat, not the worn coat he'd been wearing that first morning, but a simple but well-maintained suit he had worn for the official signing. "Before you open it," said Tomas, "I want to tell you a story. When I was your age, I made a similar mistake. I judged someone by their appearance, and later discovered that person was extraordinary in ways I couldn't have imagined. That experience changed me, taught me humility." He pushed the envelope toward Adrian. "It wasn't a coincidence that I appeared in that lobby the way I did that morning. I could have worn a suit. I could have arrived in a taxi. But I chose not to, because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought I wasn't anyone important." Adrian felt a tightness in his chest. "It was a test?" "Not exactly," said Tomas. "It was more of a revelation, an opportunity for truth to emerge, and the truth emerged, not just about you, but also about Monica, about the security guards, about how our society works." Tomas leaned forward. "But here's what's important, Adrian. You failed that initial test, but then you did something few have the courage to do. You took responsibility. You apologized genuinely. And in the 3 months since then, I've watched you change. Watched you begin to treat people with more kindness. Watched you question your own prejudices." He pointed to the envelope. "Inside that envelope is the deed to a small property I own on the outskirts of the city. It's nothing grand, just land with a simple house, but I want you to have it." Adrian shook his head vigorously. "Mr. Herrera, I can't accept this. Not after—" "You can and you will," said Tomas firmly. "Not as a reward, but as a responsibility. That property belonged to my wife. It's where she grew up. She always wanted to transform it into something that served the community, perhaps a community center, or a library, or a space for children. But we never had the resources or energy to make it happen." His eyes glistened with unexpressed emotion. "I'm giving you this because I believe you'll honor Luz's memory, that you'll use your position, your resources, your business family to create something meaningful. And in the process, you'll remember this lesson, that every person you meet carries a story, a value, a dignity that can't be measured by clothes or bank accounts." Adrian took the envelope with trembling hands. "Mr. Herrera, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything yet," Tomas responded. "Just promise me one thing. When you look at that property, when you decide what to do with it, remember that morning in the lobby. Remember how you felt, and let that feeling guide you to do the right thing." In the months that followed, Castellanos and Sons began development of Quinta Esperanza. But it wasn't the luxury project Adrian had originally proposed. Instead, working closely with Tomás and local historians, they created a mixed-use development: affordable apartments for middle-income families, commercial spaces for small local businesses, and, at the center of the complex, a public park and community museum dedicated to the neighborhood's history. The original house, built by Tomás's great-great-grandfather, was carefully preserved and integrated into the design, becoming the centerpiece of the museum. The trees planted by his great-grandfather were protected, history was honored, and Adrian, he transformed the property Tomás had given him into a community center called Casa Luz, a space dedicated to educational programs, free healthcare, and social services for those in need. He worked on it personally, not delegating the task, but donating his own time, resources, and energy. More importantly, Adrian changed the way he lived his life. He began volunteering regularly. He began truly seeing the people around him, the cleaning staff, the security guards, the waiters, the bus drivers, and treating them with the respect they deserved. He began questioning his own automatic judgments and prejudices. It wasn't an overnight transformation. Old habits are hard to break, but Adrian worked at it every day, using that shameful morning in the lobby as a moral compass that guided him back when he strayed. As for Monica Salazar, she lost her job at the Meridian Tower building. Not immediately. Don Eduardo wasn't cruel, but after a performance review that revealed multiple complaints from other visitors about her disrespectful treatment. She was dismissed with a generous severance and a neutral letter of recommendation. Adrian learned, months later, that Monica had found work at another company. He hoped she too had learned something from the experience, though he couldn't be sure. All he could control were his own actions, his own choices, his own journey of growth. 2 years after that encounter in the lobby, Adrian received a call from a hospital. Tomás Herrera had been admitted. At 93 years old, his heart was failing. Adrian rushed to the hospital. He found Tomás in a quiet room connected to monitors, but fully conscious and alert. "Adrian," said Tomás with a weak smile, "you didn't need to come." "Of course I did," Adrian replied, pulling a chair beside the bed. "Your family." They talked for hours. Tomás shared stories of his childhood, his teaching years, his life with Luz. Adrian listened, absorbing every word, recording every memory. When the sun began to set, casting golden light through the hospital window, Tomás held Adrian's hand. "Adrian," he said, his voice weak but clear, "thank you for doing something with your life, for not wasting your opportunity to make a difference." "Mr. Herrera, Let me finish," Tomás interrupted gently. "I'm proud of you, not just for what you've built or what you've achieved, but for the person you've become. You took a moment of shame and transformed it into a catalyst for change. That's rare. That's precious." Tears ran down Adrian's face. "When I die," Tomás continued, "I want you to know I'm going in peace, knowing that my family's history, the history of Quinta Esperanza, is in good hands. And more than that, knowing I touched at least one life in a meaningful way." "You've touched many lives," said Adrian, his voice breaking. "You certainly touched mine." Tomás squeezed Adrian's hand one last time. "Then my work here is complete." Tomás Herrera passed away 3 days later, surrounded by peace, his long life coming to a gentle end. His funeral was a modest but deeply moving celebration, attended by former students who traveled from across the country, by fellow historians, by neighbors and friends, and by Adrian and the entire Castellanos family. At the burial, Adrian was invited to speak. He stood before the small assembled group and shared the story of that morning in the lobby, sparing no details, not softening his own role, not making himself the hero. "Tomás Herrera taught me," said Adrian, "that the true measure of a person isn't in how you treat those above you on the social ladder, but in how you treat those below you. In truth, that distinction above and below, is itself the problem. There is no ladder. There's only humanity in all its diverse forms, and every person deserves dignity. He looked at the simple casket. I failed Mr. Herrera that first morning, but he gave me a second chance. He gave me a path to redemption. And in the process, he gave me the greatest gift anyone can give, the opportunity to become a better man. In the years that followed, Adrian continued to build on the lessons Tomás had taught him. Casa Luz expanded, serving thousands of people annually. The Quinta Esperanza development became a model for responsible community projects, winning awards and being studied in architecture and urban planning schools. But perhaps the most significant change was in the culture of Castellanos and Sons itself. Adrian, working with his father and brother, implemented new programs, scholarships for employees, corporate volunteer initiatives, equity audits to ensure fair treatment at all levels of the company. They established a policy that every new employee, regardless of position, should spend a day working in each department, including cleaning, security, maintenance, to understand all the people who make a company work. And in every conference room, beside the portraits of the company's founders, Adrian hung a photograph, Tomás Herrera at Quinta Esperanza, standing in front of the house his great-great-grandfather had built, smiling with those tired but wise eyes. Below the photograph, a plaque with words Tomás had once said, "True character is revealed not in success, but in failure. Not in how you rise, but in how you help others rise." A decade after that fateful morning, Adrian, now CEO of Castellanos and Sons after his father's retirement, stood in the lobby of the Meridian Tower building. He was there for a meeting, but had arrived early intentionally. He watched people come and go, executives in their expensive suits, messengers delivering packages, cleaning staff pushing carts, security guards at their posts, a homeless person asking if he could use the bathroom. He watched how people interacted, or didn't interact, how some were seen and others were invisible, how status and appearance still dictated who deserved courtesy and who didn't. Adrian approached the homeless man, a middle-aged man with a torn coat, who was being politely but firmly directed outside by the new receptionist. "Excuse me," said Adrian, his voice polite but firm. "This gentleman may use the facilities." The receptionist looked at Adrian, recognized him, and nodded quickly. "Of course, Mr. Castellanos." Adrian turned to the homeless man. "The restrooms are right down that corridor. Please, feel free." The man looked at Adrian with surprise and gratitude. "Thank you, sir. God bless you. God bless us all," Adrian replied softly. As he watched the man walk through the lobby, Adrian felt a wave of emotion. He thought of Tomás Herrera. He thought of that morning so long ago. He thought of how close he had come to becoming someone he wouldn't want to be. And he was grateful, not just for being caught, not just for learning, but for being given the chance to do better. Because in the end, it's not about never failing. It's about what you do after you fail. It's about choosing every day to see the humanity in every person you meet. It's about recognizing that dignity isn't conferred by clothes or bank accounts or titles, but is inherent, unchangeable, sacred. It's about living in a way that when your life ends, you can depart in peace, knowing you left the world a little better, a little kinder, a little more just. Adrian smiled, adjusted his tie, and walked toward the elevators, carrying with him the lessons of a wise old man who was once judged by his worn clothes, but who proved to be richer in character than most people would ever be in fortune. And in that smile, in that moment of quiet gratitude, was true wealth, the wealth of wisdom earned, of humility learned, of compassion practiced. The wealth of a life transformed by the kindness of a stranger who refused to allow shame to be the end of the story, but only the beginning of something much, much better.